Roughly 2 years after its launch, the Sony A7S III is still one of Sony's most used cameras, especially when it comes to video. But how does it fare after the hype? Let's find out. I've been using the A7S III for about a year now, and I have a lot to say about it. Most of it is good though, so let's start with the pro. Probably the most obvious and the best pro about this camera is the image quality. At this point, everybody knows the specs: 4K 120, 422 10-bit colors, all of that. But just the 4K 24 FPS, the standard 4K alone, is very high res and it's super sharp. It has an amazing quality, and I know a lot of people prefer to use mist filters to kind of get rid of that digital look and to go more cinematic. But for me, I think the A7S III has somewhat of a soft look to it. Not Airy Alexa, of course, but plenty cinematic. Color science has been improved on a lot. You can no longer see huge green or yellow shifting as with previous Sony cameras. There is still sometimes a little bit of yellow shift and sometimes green, somewhere in between the green and yellows. Sometimes there is a little bit of a shift, but it's nothing that cannot be corrected in post. It's very subtle and very easy to fix. The second pro is the 4K 120. Being able to slow down your footage 5 times and still maintaining 4K full frame quality is insane. Now it is a 1.1 crop, but really a 10% crop, you're still getting that 4K resolution and you're getting 120 frames per second. So the difference in quality is negligible. Now I used to use 60 frames per second a lot, and I thought that was the sweet spot for slow motion since it is not too slow and is not real time. 30 FPS kind of gives you the dreamy look, 60 FPS takes it a step further and gives you some actual slow motion. But when I started using the 120 frames per second on the Sony A7S III, everything changed. I either shoot it in real time 24 or I shoot slow motion at 120 frames per second, because you can exaggerate everything. Every movement of every living or moving object is exaggerated, and it is just very dramatic because you're slowing that footage to 5 times, which really emphasizes anything that is moving. So that is why I love 120 frames per second. And you can always dip it down to 1080p and shoot in 240 frames per second, which is 10 times the slow motion. And you can do that. It is a little bit of less quality. Sure, it's not 4K, but for some specific shots you may need that extra slow motion. I personally don't think so, but in terms of slow motion there is the option to go 240 frames per second. Last but not least, in our pro list we have the 422 10-bit colors and the dynamic range on the Sony sensor. This new sensor is just insane. Like, Sony claims 15 stops of dynamic range. In reality it is close to 13 or 14, but without getting technical, the dynamic range is insane on this camera. The highlight roll-off is very cinematic, and thanks to the 422 10-bit colors, you can always lift the shadows, decrease the highlights, and you can play with the colors almost as much as you'd like. It is not quite raw capabilities, but 10-bit is a million times better than 8-bit when it comes to color grading your footage. It is only a 2-bit difference, but 8-bit is like 60 million colors and 10-bit is closer to 1 billion colors. Okay, now moving on to the con part. I really found it hard to collect 3 things that I didn't like about my A7S III. There's one thing that first jumps to my mind is the LCD screen. While the EVF is the best that you can get on the market with 9.44 million pixels, the LCD screen, not so much. Now the rear LCD is a flip out screen that measures 3 inches with 1.4 million pixels, which is okay, it is great, you can see the colors. In comparison with the competition, which in this case is the R5, it has 2.1 million pixels, which is a lot more, and I would have loved to see, especially with that 9.44 million pixels on the EVF, I would have loved to see a higher res screen. Again, these cons are not really that big because most of what I have to say about this camera is great, but maybe it's just me nitpicking, but I think that the battery life can definitely be improved. Whenever I'm recording in 4K 60 or higher, especially when I'm recording in 4K 120, the battery life is just getting absolutely drained. Granted, it is 4K 120, but still I want to be able to record freely and not every time that I'm switching to 20 frames per second worrying about my battery life. Now this isn't a major issue, you can buy another battery or you can charge your camera via Type-C while using it. but you have to keep in mind that when shooting 4K 120, your battery is going to be heavily drained. Now, the most controversial and the last con on this list is the 12 megapixels for photography, which for some people it is the sweet spot, for some people it is very low, and for some people we just don't care about photography on the A7S III. Now, from my experience, I did shoot a lot, and I mean a lot of pictures with the A7S III, and I can say that you can easily use these photos for web sharing, Instagram, or whatever. I've always uploaded my pictures to Instagram and nobody noticed the difference. What the A7S III lacks in terms of photography is just simply cropping in on the image. So if you had a 50 megapixel sensor and you wanted to crop in onto a 20 or maybe even a 18 megapixel camera, you still have a lot of resolution, you have a lot of room to crop. But with the A7S III, you already are starting with 12 megapixels, so if you want to crop into a bit more, you're just losing resolution at that point. You're going to 10 or 8 or maybe even 6 megapixels. So that is kind of the downside of having 12 megapixels as your main sensor. The thing is, the A7S III pushes you to think about your composition. You already know that you can't crop in post, so you have to take the composition perfect as it is, and that may be a pro for some people to help them think and work more to get the perfect picture in camera. Again, this camera is not really made for professional photographers anyway, so if you are a videographer who wants some photography on the side, or if you're a hybrid shooter, I can definitely recommend this because you are getting a lot more advantages over the A7 IV, including 4K 120 with no crop, or even 4K 60 with no crop, and just overall better video capabilities. But yeah, that is it. I feel like the con list wasn't really much of a con list because this camera is really great. In my opinion, the pros just simply outweigh the cons by a lot. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you did learn something. If you have any more pros or cons, leave them down in the comments below. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.